Thank you for that. This is what the mitigation fight in South Africa looks like in particular. So this is where our greenhouse gas emissions come from, that green one being energy. And when we look at energy like this, we must remember we also need to think of what is that energy actually being used for. So half of that approximately is the generation of electricity. But in this particular graph and the way it's been quantified, it would include transport, it would include other forms of energy. So yeah, with the way these things are put together can definitely be unpacked, and one can hone in on a more kind of detailed view on where the different emissions come from, and that's obviously useful to know where the pressure needs to be placed. The blue section is industrial processes, so obviously big factories that produce greenhouse gases. A FOLU, or the yellow one, is agriculture and land use. So agriculture in itself has obviously got a carbon footprint, but anywhere where we're disturbing natural ecosystems, which can work as carbon sinks, are areas that are also a source of greenhouse gas emissions. And then the orange over there, the smallest one in this particular graph, is the waste sector. Just to kind of capture what the risks are for South Africa in particular, and there are also, again, many ways of being able to look at this and classify it, but the WITS Global Change Institute, for example, came up with a very interesting paper a couple of years ago and said for South Africa, the big risks that we need to watch out for are food insecurity and the viability of the agricultural sector. We know that with the levels of warming that are happening and are going to continue happening, for example, the kind of dryland maize that we cultivate in South Africa, which is a staple source of food, is going to battle in increasing temperatures. So how do we address that? Shortages of clean water. So we know that South Africa is, I think, the 29th most water scarce country in the world. So we've already on the back foot in terms of access to clean, drinkable water. And we know from the sort of climate change impacts that are coming that those are going to be compromised. So those obviously need to be carefully managed, and that agenda really needs to be at the top of the list if we think of our needs as human beings and as life on Earth. The third one is a badly handled transition to low carbon energy. So we know, we saw from that previous graph where the greenhouse gas emissions come from. Our electricity system is particularly carbon intensive, being based mostly on coal. So that switch from coal to renewables, which is really what it boils down to, can be done in a good way or a bad way. And we can see from the sort of energy and electricity space what a contested terrain it is, with different interests and different sort of philosophies and ambitions. So if that doesn't go well, obviously it can give rise to all sorts of complications, including energy security issues and also just transition issues. How do we make the switch without sacrificing people, without leaving them behind? We need to ensure that vulnerable workers in the coal value chain, for example, are not left to bear the brunt of this transition, and hence the importance of ensuring that we create opportunities as we transition. Heat stress, so that's physically the heat. We know that heat waves are on the increase, and that obviously has very direct health impacts. I think one of the IPCC reports in this last assessment cycle actually highlighted that the temperature inside a dwelling in an informal settlement in South Africa is sometimes between 5 to 7 degrees higher than outside. So you can imagine the consequences that has on people. And then disrupted ecosystems and loss of biodiversity. We're starting to see the interplay between climate change and biodiversity being more widely understood. And really, they're kind of twin symptoms of the system which so far has kind of enabled us to exploit the planet and exploit people with little regard for the limits. So just looking at using the law in the climate crisis. So this is what we have had available to us up until the Climate Change Act. So first of all, the Constitution and the Bill of Rights continue to remain extremely important. And certainly in the legal work we do, both in litigation and advocacy, these are often issues that are raised. We have our Section 24 right to an environment that's not harmful to health or well-being, which also takes into account both current and future generations. So that's obviously a very, very powerful one. But there are other constitutional rights that are also impacted by climate change. And if you think of the extent of the crisis and the impacts, potentially it's most of those rights. But the ones that come to mind initially and that we do argue in some of our court papers are the right to life, the right of access to food and water, right of equality, and also the rights of the child to be have their interests be put paramount in decision-making that affects them. Because of the nature of the climate crisis, we know that many of the impacts are going to intensify, whether we mitigate well or not. And it's going to be future generations that really bear the brunt of it. So in a sense, to continue emitting greenhouse gases the way we do is borrowing from those future generations or stealing from them, because they're not really having a say at this point in time. So elevating the need to have those voices of the youth at all the necessary tables is also a core piece of our work. And then very importantly, NEMA, or our National Environment Management Act. So that's the sort of overarching framework act, which deals with different aspects of environmental management. Very key. So it doesn't, by design, it doesn't go into specific environmental harms per se. It talks about them in principle, but obviously climate change is one of them. But even that's been a journey that wasn't necessarily always recognized. What this act says is that certain impacts that might flow from certain developments need to be properly assessed. That's where we get our environmental impact assessment regime from. And in around 2015, we went to court on behalf of various clients to ensure that climate change impact assessments were recognized as being a necessary part of this assessment process. So yeah, while we'll see that the Climate Change Act goes into this a lot more specifically, we certainly foresee that we're going to continue using NEMA and the principles in that act. The Air Quality Act, or NEMAQA, a bit more specific, generally was formulated to deal with toxic air pollution, but greenhouse gases were declared priority pollutants some years ago, and therefore the sort of management system in terms of reporting emissions was expanded in that way to include greenhouse gases, which are not toxic in themselves, but they come from the same sources in most cases as the toxic air pollution. So it's a very interlinked issue, although we're talking about slightly different types of harms, with obviously the toxic air pollution being more about direct health impacts from breathing that toxic air in. And then the Carbon Tax Act, arguably the first piece of legislation directly focused on climate change, but of a relatively narrow scope. Nonetheless, a very important piece of legislation, particularly if they start to introduce more realistic carbon tax rates. So at the moment, those tax rates are very low compared to the cost of the harms that are caused by the emissions, but an important area of the law to keep track of and to use as and when necessary and appropriate. And then very importantly are the international treaties and obligations. So the United Nations Framework Convention of Climate Change, or UNFCCC, is obviously the body where the different nations of the world um, convene and use that platform to negotiate how climate response should happen around the globe. Out of that body came the Paris Agreement, which is, I think it's been signed by 198 nations. There's a small handful that haven't. We'll need to see. The USA wanted to pull out of this when Trump was in his last presidency. And if he gets in again, I guess we would need to watch that threat. Under the Paris Agreement, we have what we call the nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, and these are each country's targets in terms of how much or what their ambition is in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So we've got ours there among all the other countries, and you'll see just now that the Climate Change Act actually incorporates our NDC into domestic law for the first time. So yeah, we do have the obligations from an international perspective, but now being in domestic legislation, it gives it a lot more power and strength. There's also the United Nations Convention for the Law of the Sea. So that's come onto the radar quite recently because there are international obligations in terms of protecting oceans, and the tribunal responsible for that treaty has held that climate change is a cause of harm to the oceans, and inadequate or negligent behavior on the parts of states is unlawful in terms of that. We've got the International Court of Justice, or ICJ, considering an advisory opinion on similar grounds, not limited to the ocean, but looking at the obligations of states to manage climate change. And then, as I say, more recently on the map is the Convention on Biological Diversity, or biodiversity, which, as I said, is very interlinked with climate change. So we do pull those international obligations into the advocacy work as well. They're very important, and the obligations to observe these are very clear. I don't know if they always have the kind of weight that they should have in domestic advocacy or litigation. So again, that's why it's really good to have this Climate Change Act that we now do. So I think something went wrong with my slides, but before I go into this, I just want to mention that the Climate Change Act has been signed by the President on the 23rd of July, but we've got a clause in there, or section, which is section 38, which says it comes into operation at a date proclaimed by the President in the Government Gazette. And that has not happened yet. So we're actually in this strange in-between space at this point in time where we've got the act, but it is not in effect yet. We have engaged with the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment and inquired from the department what the intentions are and when we can expect this proclamation. At this point in time, they've just advised us that there are internal discussions and they can't tell us yet. So this is of some concern because technically we could sit in this strange no man's land for some time. So we are going to be starting to engage with the Environment Minister as well as the Presidency to find out what's going on. Yeah, the network has been speaking as it does, and it seems that there's a view out there, or particularly coming from the state, that this proclamation can't happen until all the regulations are in place. This is something that we are looking at closely. It doesn't necessarily make that much sense to us legally. I think there are many acts in operation that then see the regulation making process coming in afterwards, but we are looking at that a little bit more closely. We know that, for example, carbon budget regulations, which we'll touch on just now, are in the process of being formulated. But yeah, the problem is that many of the key mechanisms in the Act won't come into being until that proclamation has happened, and many important timeframes won't come into being, and we'll unpack those a little bit as we go along. So just to give you an idea of the architecture of the Act, chapters 2 and 3 are both effectively institutional arrangements. So chapter 2 looks at policy alignment and some of the institutional arrangements, and then chapter 3 focuses in on the obligations on municipalities and provinces. Chapter 4 then looks at the national adaptation to the impacts of climate change. Chapter 5, greenhouse gas emissions and removals, or climate change mitigation as a whole. And then quite standard in any piece of legislation in South Africa is the section on general matters and transitional arrangements. So to help us sort of look at how we can use this Act going forward, I've made these little icons at the bottom. So the one on the left is an icon that will come up against items where there is the potential for judicial review, or basically using the law to keep the state in check, to make sure that it's doing what it's meant to do and not doing what it's not meant to do. And then the icon on the right is where the opportunities are for ongoing public participation. And that's obviously a critically important tool to ensure climate justice, because we could have a situation where climate change response, if it were to be undertaken by the state and by business alone, without civil society being involved, it would obviously evolve in such a way that, you know, benefits those two sectors, if you like. And the likelihood is that business as usual would prevail. So having the voice to speak up for climate justice and to ensure that vulnerable communities, at-risk parties, etc., are also heard and their considerations are also taken into account is obviously critically important. So going into the institutional arrangements in a bit more detail, and this gives you an idea of how the intention here is to mainstream climate change and climate change response throughout the state. So the one important clause, or section 6, is says, in the event of any conflict between a provision of this Act and other legislation specifically relating to climate change, this Act prevails. So that sounds quite good, but when we look at it talking about legislation specifically relating to climate change, there's not that much. It would have been a lot better from a climate response point of view if it simply said any other legislation. So this is one of the problems with climate response at a state level, is that there's effectively competition between sectors and departments and policy directions and the underlying ambitions. A very obvious one in South Africa is the kind of competition between the need for a sound climate change response, and that is overseen by the Environment Department, and perhaps the competition that was in existence with, for example, the former Department of Mineral Resources and Energy, and now it will be the Mineral Resources and Petroleum Resources, as well as the Energy and Electricity Department. So where we see, for example, the authorizing of fossil fuel exploration and extraction, I mean, that goes completely directly against a sound climate change response. So there we have that competition between those two departments, for example. Also very important and potentially very powerful, but very difficult to maybe monitor and enforce as well, is in section 7, which speaks of the alignment of policies. So that says that every organ of state that exercises a power or performs a function that is affected by climate change, and that would be most of them, or if not all, or is entrusted with powers and duties aimed at the achievement, promotion, and protection of a sustainable environment, must review and, if necessary, revise, amend, coordinate, and harmonize their policies, laws, measures, programs, and decisions to ensure that the risks of climate change impacts and associated vulnerabilities are taken into consideration, and to give effect to the principles and objects set out in this act. So if we think what's being asked of here is that a whole raft of laws, policies, measures, programs, and decisions will need to be changed. And this is an area that provides a potentially very powerful, but very kind of blunt instrument tool to make sure that climate response starts to meaningfully be adopted by different organs of state. And to understand that a bit more, let's go a little bit into what the objects and the principles are. So in general, I'd say the objects and principles of the Climate Change Act are very powerfully formulated. They're not perfect and there are gaps, but they really do say many of the right things. Objects and principles are kind of not as powerful as direct obligations. So they are a bit more generally worded, and there is room for interpretation, and there's room for interpretation around the scale and the pace at which they need to be adhered to. So it's not that easy to make an argument that says, excuse me, Mr. Decision Maker, your decision here is falling foul of principle 3D and expect that to go all the way. But at the same time, they are a very powerful source to pull into argument and motivate for why the action that you're challenging is not in accordance with them. So looking at the objects in a bit of detail, so the objects are to provide for a coordinated and integrated response by the economy and society to climate change and its impacts in accordance with the principles of cooperative governance. So if we look at what the Act does provide for here, I'd say that that object is well met with what we see in the Act, at least on paper. The next one is to provide for the effective management of inevitable climate change impacts by enhancing adaptive capacity, strengthening resilience, and reducing vulnerability to climate change, with a view to building social, economic, and environmental resilience and an adequate national adaptation response in the context of the global climate change response. Again, very solid and very sensible. To make a fair contribution to the global effort to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that avoids dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. Again, a very good object. That mention of fair contribution. So from one perspective, that makes absolute sense. We know from a global climate justice perspective that much of the climate change that we are seeing now is as a result of historical emissions that are not South Africa's. The USA has cumulatively emitted the most, the EU very high as well. China is currently emitting the most. So it's fair that those countries and economies that benefited from using up the carbon space back then, on top of all the colonization that they did, really owes the global south or the developing world a climate debt. And that is why at the COP talks, we have a lot of haggling and negotiating and fighting about getting funding from the richer nations to be channeled to the quote unquote poorer nations for climate change response, be that adaptation, be that mitigation, be that loss and damage. But that fair contribution kind of proviso there also gets misused. Our NDC, or nationally determined contribution, or Paris Agreement target, has already been adjusted for what we call a fair share. So we're already not expected to decarbonize at the same pace as the USA, for example. But those interests in South Africa that want to stick to business as usual and kind of resist greenhouse gas emissions reduction use clauses like this to say that, well, we need to develop and we need to exploit our fossil fuel resources to do that. It's absolutely true that we need to develop, but the extent to which we need to use fossil fuel resources to do that is what's really open to question, and there's a lot of abuse of concepts like that. The next one is to ensure a just transition towards a low carbon economy and society, considering national circumstances. So to the best of my knowledge, this is the first time the concept of a just transition is brought into domestic law. We have a just transition framework, which is effectively a policy document that's been approved by cabinet, but here we have it in an actual act. At the same time, it doesn't go on to say very much more about it. It's generally alluded to in quite broad terms, but nonetheless, it elevates this notion of a just transition. And that is really one of the keys to a sound climate response. If we're going to decarbonize without looking after vulnerable workers and vulnerable communities, then we're not meeting the needs of climate justice. And we're also going to run into social and political headwinds, because it's not fair to expect certain people, simply because of where they work, to bear the brunt of this. The benefits and the costs related to the decarbonization journey need to be equitably shared across society, something which hasn't happened all along. So in that way, a sound climate response is an opportunity to really right many of the socioeconomic injustices that we've lived with for a very long time. Speaks about our international commitments and obligations, and then talks about protecting and preserving the planet for the benefit of present and future generations of humankind. So they're recognizing the need for intergenerational justice and making sure that the rights of future generations are protected in this whole exercise. And then going into some of the principles, and I'm going into these in a bit of detail because, yeah, just to, as we said, the policies, laws, and measures of all organs of state need to measure up to these. So at some point in time, capacity permitting, civil society and others will start to monitor, where are those revisions happening? Are they happening quickly enough, and are they in accordance with these objects and principles? It's a mammoth task, and obviously one starts with the low-hanging fruit. For example, our electricity, because that's our biggest emitter, are those policies and measures and decisions measuring up to these principles? Things like the integrated resource plan and some of the other legislation and policies that relate to energy planning. So from the principles perspective, the principles that are in NEMA, or the National Environment Management Act, are incorporated into here. And those are very powerful, again, on paper. To turn them into meaningful action is more challenging. Climate systems should be protected for the benefit of present and future generations of humankind. So no problems there. Maybe it should be for all life, but humankind will do. The principle that acknowledges international equity in each country's common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities in light of different national circumstances. So that's a bit like that fair contribution point that I made earlier. This wording most of it comes straight from the Paris Agreement. Again, it creates a space to push for climate justice, but it does also create that opportunity for abuse by those who are wedded to business as usual. It also expands on the just transition here, talking about transition towards low carbon, climate resilient, and ecologically sustainable economies and societies, which contribute to the creation of decent work for all, social inclusion, and the eradication of poverty. So very important here, recognizing the nexus between our kind of historical and structural challenges of inequality, poverty, and unemployment, and how that interlinks with climate change and a climate change response. Again, a contested space, because some would say that taking climate responsible action aggravates those other conditions. And if done badly, yes, it can. And if done well, it's an opportunity to actually improve those situations. The need for integrated management in the context of climate change. So really trying to rope in all the necessary organs of state and decision makers, which I think this act does reasonably well. The need for decision making to consider the special needs and circumstances of localities and people that are particularly vulnerable to the adverse effects of climate change, including vulnerable workers and groups such as women, especially poor and rural women, children, especially infants and child-headed families, the aged, poor, the sick, and persons with disabilities. So we know that this is one of the great injustices of climate change, is that those who are most at risk and bear the brunt of the impacts have actually contributed the least to the crisis. So having this recognized is very important and kind of interweaves climate justice into the act. Very importantly, and this is also in NEMA in a form, is the need for a risk-averse and cautious approach to be adopted, which takes into account the limits of current knowledge about causes and effects of climate change and the consequences of decisions and actions in relation thereto. Very, very important, because, I mean, we deal all the time with having to analyze and challenge deficient climate change impact assessments. And sometimes it feels like this is presented as a negotiable, where when one reads between the lines, one can see, well, there is a risk acknowledged, but you know, the property or the developer feels that it's worth doing, and the decision maker from the state agrees, which goes contrary to this risk-averse and cautious approach. So these are tools that we can weave into the work when challenging projects like that. Very importantly, the need for climate change mitigation and adaptation responses to be informed by evolving climate change scientific knowledge, and decisions should be based on the best available science. So one would think that goes without saying, but in the contested area of ideas and interests, people can rely on all sorts of things, including things which are nowhere near the best available science. So having that spelt out here is quite important. Climate change response, which requires preventative measures to mitigate the causes of climate change and strengthen resilience. And here's a really important one from a polluter pays perspective. The costs of responding to the adverse impacts of climate change and of mitigation, which must be paid for by those responsible for causing the adverse impacts. So potentially opening up a whole field where the polluters, the greenhouse gas emitters, actually get forced to pay for the very expensive exercise of mitigation and adaptation, and also to compensate for loss and damage. Again, being a principle, it's not a silver bullet, but it's really great to have this clause here and this recognition here. And yeah, as the landscape of climate change loss and damage lawsuits expands, this principle will give some power to that. And then a recognition that a robust and sustainable economy and a healthy society depends on healthily, well-functioning ecosystems, and enhancing the sustainability of the economic, social, and ecological services is an integral component. Yeah, the concept of ecosystem services is always sometimes a bit uncomfortable because it's, in a sense, commodifies and puts a monetary value on components of a system which are really hard to quantify, especially when we consider that, I mean, all of the ecosystems really form a part of the overall ecosystem, and all of it is needed to function well. And then finally, an integrated climate change response requires the enhancement of public awareness of climate change causes and impacts and the promotion of participation and action at all levels. So perhaps a principle like this can be used to push for more climate change education in schools, and it certainly can be used to motivate for sound public participation processes, which are often not observed as much as they need to be. Okay, going into some of the institutional arrangements in a little more detail. So from a provincial level, there's already at provincial level what they call the Premier's Intergovernmental Forum. And what this act says is that this will now serve as the provincial forum of climate change as well. So what it's doing here is ensuring that those intergovernmental forums have climate change on the agenda. That's a good thing in a way, so that we know that this important topic doesn't fall off. I guess the danger here is that it just becomes yet another agenda item, and is not necessarily given the space for the necessary discussions and decisions to be taken. So that's something that will unfold in practice, but good to see it formalized. And it's this forum that needs to coordinate the climate change response actions in accordance with the Act. So there where I've got the public participation icon and the little red X next to it means that there's no public participation here, and I've highlighted it because it's noteworthy. It would be a place that would be really good to have public participation. I mean, obviously the entire public can't sit in on these forums, but perhaps there are mechanisms that can allow for what happens at those forums to be brought to the people, and the people's views, thoughts, and needs being brought back up to the forum. And it talks about, this is a may, not a must, but establish a technical support structure. So, I mean, it's sort of common sense that a lot of climate change response is going to cost a lot of money. So financial resources and the limitations on financial resources are always a challenge, but it's worth recognizing the challenge in accessing technical resources. So many of the kind of risk assessments that need to be done to really understand what could be coming from a climate point of view and from a knock-on effect point of view really require sound scientific knowledge across a range of subdisciplines, from biology to civil engineering. So what's going to need to happen is that technical support, those streams need to open up whereby the right expertise can be in the right places. So that is also a money issue when you're paying experts for their time and their knowledge, but also just having access to them. And hopefully we're going to see an evolution where state decision makers and that sort of level of expertise keeps on increasing, so that we, again, going back to taking our actions in accordance with the best available science. Very similar on the municipal side. So the municipalities are really critically important in this whole climate response landscape. In a sense, it's the municipalities that are often left with managing the fallout of climate change impacts. Think of the eThekwini floods. You know, it's sure that it happened in the city, but also around. But it's the city that often bears the brunt, and where many of the deaths occur in a situation like that. So ensuring that municipalities are on board is very important, and supporting them is very important. We know that many of the larger metros have some form of climate change response plan already. And again, they probably have the resources and access to the technical skills to do that. What is the case with small towns, perhaps in far-flung areas, perhaps that are not particularly solvent, yeah, are battling financially? They can't get left behind in this process. So very important that municipalities get looked after and supported, as well as exhibit the political will themselves. Then the next institutional arrangement is the PCC, or Presidential Climate Change Commission. So this body has been operational for 2 and a bit years already, and has actually done a lot of amazing work. And the Act will make it a statutory body, so give it more status, kind of more certainty. The Act also prescribes kind of various practical and logistical arrangements, like the appointment of commissioners, of an executive director, dealing with finances and that kind of thing, financial administration. So this is the body that, I mean, it's two kind of main constructive outputs based on my observations anyways. The one thing is it commissions a wide range of scientifically sound reports and research, which that then get used to inform its recommendations to government. So it's a place to get really good information. And so far, it has done that very well. And then also very importantly, it's the place where the social compact, or the social agreement about how we tackle climate change, how we decarbonize, how we do a just transition, is negotiated between business, labor, government, and civil society. And again, in my opinion, that has worked very effectively. Some really tricky, challenging areas of disagreement have been worked through. And the commission has been very transparent. Not flawlessly so in all cases, but generally the public get to sit in on the meetings. There are many public consultations that get facilitated, and the reports are all made available, including the underlying reports and references. So yeah, my opinion is it's done very well. That could change. The kind of leadership there could change. One could get different waves of commissioners coming through. So it's good to know that the powers are kind of defined in this act, so that one can keep the commission to account as well, if necessary. And there's one of our judicial review icons over there. Because we now have rules that are in law, they can be used to do exactly that. Going into adaptation in a bit more detail now. So this is one of the areas where the delayed operationalization of the Act is really problematic, because there are timeframes here for adaptation that are not going to start running until the Act comes into operation. And they're already, those deadlines are already too far away, in our opinion. But what the provinces and municipalities need to do is undertake climate change needs and response assessments. So that's really looking at where are we with climate change, what is coming, what are those impacts going to be, and what do we need to do to respond those. So it's the assessment first, and then following that comes the implementation plan. So based on that assessment, is coming up with concrete and specific measures about how the response will look, where resources will be channeled, what measures will be put in place. They're required to identify and spatially map vulnerabilities based on the best available science. And then this plan, this climate change response plan, needs to form part of the provincial environmental implementation plans, or at municipal level, the IDPs, or integrated development plans. So this is really roping in those different tiers of government. Again, very important to ensure that the political will is there to support them and capacitate them to do these things. At a national adaptation level, the minister, so that'll be the Minister of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment, must determine national adaptation objectives and indicators, a date for incorporation of those objectives into relevant planning, and then develop adaptation scenarios. So that's really saying, well, we expect this, broadly speaking, to come in terms of climate change impacts. It might look like A, depending on certain conditions, or B, or C, or D, and those would be the different scenarios that ministry needs to oversee the development of. Very specifically mentions again, it must be based on best available science, includes systematic observation and early warning, and include consideration of potential impacts and contain response options to build adaptive capacity and resilience. So we know that the east coast of the country is probably going to continue to get more violent rainfall. So looking at how that could look, what those impacts could be, and what the response options could be. And this process is subject to public participation. And because those obligations are there, if they are not carried out correctly, it is also open to being challenged by judicial review. So yeah, two of the areas where we can exercise our democracy. And, you know, hopefully as climate literacy improves and as civil society gets more capacitated and as community groupings get more capacitated and become more familiar with the issues, the engagements with state around these measures will continue to increase. Once that has been done, then the minister must come up with a national adaptation strategy and plan. So that would be 2 years after the act comes into operation. Again, that timeframe is not started because of the proclamation that hasn't happened yet. And the idea there is to achieve a reduction of vulnerability for economy, society, and the environment, provide strategic and policy directive for adaptation, and provide an integrated and a coordinated approach to adaptation management, which would also include NGOs, private sectors, and communities, and it says where relevant. I think one of the very important things from a climate justice perspective is we need to keep ensuring that climate adaptation is not done downwards to people and communities without those people and communities being able to feed their needs and observations upwards into the process. There's such a thing that's recognized in the IPCC reports as maladaptation. So something that looks like adaptation, it's intended to be adaptation, but it's not appropriate and has other unintended consequences and can end up making the situation worse. So there'd be people that live in informal settlements, for example, or rural villages or wherever it may be, that understand what their needs are, and understand how the land and themselves have interacted over years and even centuries, and know what their needs are to have a dignified life. So it's important that those voices feed into this process, so that we don't have only a top-down approach, which can have the kind of consequence of disregarding needs on the ground. Once that national plan is in place, then the Schedule 2 ministers, so those are virtually all the ministers, there's a schedule in the Act which spells them out, need to come identify and map their risks and vulnerability in their sectors. So be that energy, mineral resources, human settlements, transport, agriculture, whatever it might be. Come up with measures and mechanisms to manage those, and then come up with sector adaptation strategies and plans. So that is, again, subject to public participation. And if it's not done properly, or done lawfully, then it is subject to review. So again, an area to exercise democracy. And this is where one wants civil society, academia, and practitioners, formal and informal, in those sectors to be engaged, so that we don't get a situation where, for example, Department of Agriculture's idea of adaptation is to lock ourselves into contracts for genetically modified seeds that are supposedly drought resistant. Which can look like an adaptation solution, but has all of these other consequences. So again, we want the voices of people to come into these processes and ensure environmental and climate justice. And then climate change mitigation. So this is how we reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The minister needs to determine the greenhouse gas emissions trajectory, again, subject to public participation, again, reviewable if not done properly. Currently, our NDC or Paris Agreement target is that trajectory. So we do have one now. Our NDC, just as a matter of interest, is generally, according to the kind of science-based monitoring services across the world, insufficient. It's an improvement over the initial 2015 version. Most of the countries in the world are insufficient. I think only Morocco is actually completely sufficient at this point in time. So yeah, that's the target that we need to work towards to try and reduce global warming to 1.5 degrees over pre-industrial levels. So that's almost the bar or the map that we're aiming for with all of these measures is that reduction trajectory. The Paris Agreement does say that these targets need to get stricter when they're submitted every 5 years. So that's something that we need to keep an eye on. And I think there's quite a lot of work going on in the background now to prepare our next NDC, which will be submitted next year. And as we are used to, we're probably expecting to have to engage with that because probably we won't feel like it's ambitious enough, but let's see. Then one of the more specific tools is what they call the sectoral emissions targets in the Act. So a year after the Act is in place, the minister must list sectors which require these. And then the minister, in consultation with the responsible ministers, must set them. And then the responsible ministers must implement them. So there has been background work being done on this, and a sectoral emissions target report, or draft one, was released for comment in April. We commented, our comments on the website. And this process is really to say, what is the remaining carbon space left available? What is the remaining carbon budget? How much more can we emit before we compromise the climate too much? And in a sense, this is where different sectors almost have to compete for that remaining carbon space. And that is quite a political process. You'll see here that it's subject to public participation. But, you know, where we have a situation where, for example, our biggest emitters, energy and electricity in particular, we have a sector like agriculture, which is a lot more difficult to reduce greenhouse gas emissions just because of the nature of the activities, the kind of spread of role players within that sector. You know, with electricity, through an instrument like the Integrated Resource Plan, or IRP, one can almost manage this emissions reduction with really good choices and decisions in a document like that. We also have, for example, in the industrial sector, steelmaking, and steelmaking is a lot trickier to decarbonize than electricity, for example. With electricity, the technology is there, renewable energy, and it's a case of, I mean, there are challenges and hurdles to overcome for sure, but really technologically and economically, it makes a lot of sense. So it's, in a sense, not fair for the electricity sector, which could decarbonize more quickly, but isn't doing so for various reasons, to kind of encroach in the space for agriculture or steel making, just as an example. So it's going to be interesting to see exactly how this allocation process plays out and where the sectors and ministers will fight with each other for more of that carbon space. Yeah, that remains to be seen. The minister must also list greenhouse gases, the actual gases themselves, and the activities which give rise to those gases and cause or exacerbate climate change, and determine emission thresholds to identify persons subject to a carbon budget. So that is really going to be larger emitters, and that's almost exclusively going to be companies and utilities. So this is going to a particular party, an Eskom, a Sasol, an ArcelorMittal, a Glencore, whatever it might be, and say, right, this is your carbon budget and you may not exceed it. So that's, yeah, the line in the sand, which is used to compel those persons, they call them, but those entities to reduce emissions in alignment with those limits. And here's one of the problems, and those of you that have been sort of joining us in the advocacy over the past years will know that we were quite unhappy that it was not made an offense to exceed your carbon budget. And the way that they intend to enforce this is to say that anyone who exceeds their carbon budget is going to be subject to a higher carbon tax rate. So yes, for sure, to have to go into the sort of punitive levels of carbon tax and pay that is definitely a deterrent. But you can have a situation where an emitter might do some calculations and decide it's actually better for them to pay the higher carbon tax rate and continue emitting beyond their carbon budget. And in fact, we heard our second largest emitters say that much in the carbon tax hearings at the beginning of last year. So if it was a penalty and an offense, it gives the state an opportunity to ultimately then prohibit the exceedance of that budget, but that's not there. So at this point in time, we're going to have to hope that the carbon tax rates mechanism works. We're still hoping that the carbon budget regulations might bring in some punitive measures, but looking at the political will around this, we're not holding our breath. These people or persons or entities that have carbon budgets must submit greenhouse gas mitigation plans to the minister. It's an offense not to submit a plan, but it's not an offense to not stick to your plan. So again, a kind of watering down of the teeth that we feel should be there. And yeah, maybe in due course, we'll be able to influence that more strongly. But for now, we need to live with an act that is at least a little bit toothless when it comes to mitigation. That is unfortunate. And then a regulation making process. So there are a few sort of optional areas where a minister may make regulations around giving effect to international commitments, around incentives and disincentives to encourage behavior change, to promote effective monitoring, evaluation, and assessment of progress, and around the administration and operation of the Presidential Climate Commission. So we may or may not see regulations around these issues. Where the minister is obliged to make regulations, it's around the carbon budgets. So how they'll be allocated, how they'll be reviewed, revised, complied with and enforced. And that's where we again hoping perhaps some penalties might come in. As well as looking at the detail, the content of the greenhouse gas mitigation plan. So that process is underway. We've sat on some of those meetings. I don't know. Yeah, I hope we see it sooner rather than later, those regs. I'm not sure whether we will. And then once the regulations are in place, the actual process of allocating the carbon budgets happens. And this is not subject to public participation, which is of great concern, because one does get the sense that behind closed doors, big emitters, which obviously have a lot of political and financial clout, have untoward influence or power over the state decision makers. And that's why ultimately we're not seeing a state that is as committed to climate response as it needs to be. So there are some offenses and penalties, but I mean, they are important, but the big stuff is missing. But failure to provide information or providing false information for a report is an offense. Not preparing a mitigation plan is one. Not complying with a notice by the minister regarding the phase out or phase down of synthetic greenhouse gases is one. So yeah, some teeth, but not the teeth that we need in terms of carbon budgets. And then access to information. So that's quite weak in the Act. It says that any act that is provided to the minister must be publicly available, subject to PIA, or Promotion of Access to Information Act, and for PIA, the Protection of Personal Information Act. Those two pieces of legislation provide a range of defenses for not providing information, and they get, in our opinion, abused. So we're not seeing the kind of proactive, full, transparent provision of information that we feel should be there. And this is also relates to information provided to the minister. So the question is, what about information that is generated by the minister? So we really think that all aspects of climate change response need to be publicly available. And it's going to, I think, be a degree of a fight to get that. But we also know that there is a national climate change information system being developed. And yeah, we'll have to see what that looks like. Hopefully it contains more rather than less, but certainly our experience over the last 15 years to get the really key information that one wants from emitters, from regulators, is a challenge. And we often have to run around quite extensively to get hold of it. So things like carbon budgets would be of interest, of course, the content of greenhouse gas mitigation plans, emissions data, who's emitting what from what plants, how does that compare to last month, et cetera, et cetera. The actual risk and vulnerability assessments that the provinces and municipalities need to come up with would be very important to know the content of, as well as the response plans, as well as the national and sector adaptation plans. Many of these will be published, but again, there might be detail there that is not, that we might have to go to some lengths to get hold of. And then what does this act mean for litigation? Climate change litigation is growing around the world, kind of in leaps and bounds. A lot of it historically has been against states for inadequate climate ambition. Increasingly, we're seeing climate litigation against emitters for loss and damage, for instance. So obviously, especially where those icons were around judicial review, to challenge any organ of state that is not doing what it should be doing in terms of this act, or is doing it incorrectly or inadequately, that is an opportunity to challenge that organ of state, generally probably through review. But I think we'll see a lot of creative law, kind of lawfare, evolving over the next few years in this space. And decision making, I think the Act does give additional ammunition when you're challenging a climate harmful development. Certain aspects of the Act can be used in actions like that. Generally, the litigation landscape globally around challenging emitters, its compliance with acts and regulations. So this is an interesting conundrum. What if one wanted to sue a large emitter? Because one is saying that the large volumes of greenhouse gas emissions are causing climate harm, which is causing kind of harm on the ground. What would the case be if that emitter was in fact within its carbon budget, and one feels that that carbon budget is too high? Would that give them a defense to say, well, the state thinks I'm within the limits, so who are you to come and say that we're exceeding that? So it can go both ways. Obviously, in the case of an emitter exceeding its carbon budget, on the other hand, then one has the kind of easier route to say they're acting wrongfully. Directors' liability, so that's another field of climate litigation around the world. And there's not that much in this Act that would necessarily strengthen a case like that. But one will look creatively and see what can be used. Misrepresentation or greenwashing. So many of the climate change cases in the US and Europe are around this, using effectively something like consumer protection laws to challenge emitters that have been claiming that their products are not harmful when in fact they have known that they are. And then claims for losses and damages. Again, nothing, unfortunately, in this act which necessarily gives strong and easy ammunition to claims like that. And one would be relying on the common law and in South Africa, the law of delict to prosecute claims for compensation for losses and damages. Right, so I think that's it from the presentation perspective. So yeah, very happy to answer questions and have a discussion.
Thank you so much, Brandon. Yes, we do have a few questions. There was a hand up from Mapaseka. I wonder if, are you still here, Mapaseka, or have you dropped off now? Okay, potentially just dropped off. There are a few questions, just having to sift through them here on the chat, Brandon.
Okay. I can see some that I can quickly jump in if you like.
Yes, please, Brandon.
Eugene is asking if we can challenge the hydrogen hype as greenwashing. Perhaps we could, not necessarily through this act. There are people, I know Fossil Free South Africa is working in that direction around challenging false advertising and so on, and we'll get there. I don't think it's no very obvious legal tools right at this point in time. How does the bill affect small and micro business? I mean, small and micro business is not likely to get a carbon budget. So the bill or this act itself, probably not that directly, but it's going to have big implications. Entire supply chains are going to be impacted because somewhere perhaps in a supply chain, there's a big operator that is subject to a carbon tax. So it's, yeah, that will be seen, but I think more the concern is how climate change itself affects small and micro business. Yeah, that's a bit of a quick answer for quite that could be a seminar in itself, but a good question.
Thanks, Brandon. In the question and answer little box, there's a question from Jeff. Will there be a critique of the act? There are quite a few questions in there, but the first one is, will there be a critique of the act?
Jeff, I'm not quite sure what you mean by that. I mean, I think it's obviously going to be analyzed across the board from civil society to business to organs of state. And I'm sure many complaints. But you're otherwise not quite sure what you're meaning there. Impacts of climate change on people may lay hidden under Adaptation confidentiality. That's an interesting question. Would the act say anything about this? So it doesn't say anything about this specifically. Yeah, that would be an interesting question. I don't know if that confidentiality would be breached, and I'm wondering if the reason behind the question there is to say we need to know what the health impacts of climate change are and how do we collate that. Yeah, not easy and subject to a whole range of regulation around privacy, and so no, I wouldn't say that this act necessarily trumps that confidentiality. Funds available for communities that lost their house during climate disasters. Yeah, that's what it all comes down to, really, is the damage and the money. So the act does talk about a finance mechanism. And what it says is the minister must prescribe a mechanism to support and finance the Republic's climate change response, planning, and implementation. It doesn't talk about compensation for loss and damage. So I don't think the act is necessarily going to make easy the path to obtain compensation. I think we're going to have to be suing emitters in due course and actually going after the polluters and making them pay. There is also the loss and damage mechanism at the United Nations level, whereby, again, richer nations are supposed to contribute to a fund that then gets used to compensate and address loss and damage poorer nations. Interestingly, it's going to be interesting to see whether South Africa ends up on the side that actually need to pay in or receive, because although we're small compared to the USA and China and the EU in terms of emissions, we're big. We're the biggest in Africa, and we're the 13th largest in the world. So, yeah, that fight to get money for damage is really only beginning, and unfortunately, the Act doesn't kind of provide any easy solutions there. What are the obligations of municipalities and provinces regarding to enforce compliance with minimum emission standards? So, I mean, they do have obligations in terms of being the effective local air quality officers in many cases, but the minimum emission standards don't cover greenhouse gas emissions. So that's more on the toxic air pollution side. Yeah, and even with greenhouse gas emissions, a lot of that will happen at a very central level and not so much municipality and provinces. David, if I owned a coal mine or a fossil fuel, what would I most dislike about this act? Yeah, good question. I guess you would probably not like a carbon budget if it was allocated to you. And you wouldn't like the sectoral emissions target if the minister responsible was committed to adhering to that, because they might not give you that prospecting license. But yeah, I think that question is great in that it reveals the somewhat toothless nature of the act when it comes to mitigation. Jeff, yeah, would there be a summary of all emissions and provisions that need tightening up? Yeah, the process of analyzing and starting to store a list of possible best practices and ideal improvements will happen over time. Yeah, I mean, Bongani is talking about worrying about the implementation of the regulations, even though it looks positive. Absolutely. Without political will and without the resources to enforce, it can just be close to another paper exercise like the air quality laws. So for sure. And this is why we need to keep pushing as citizens, as people in the country, as people with representatives in government, etc. We keep pushing, we keep understanding the issues, we keep telling the stories and spreading the knowledge. And, you know, one day it's going to take a big groundswell of people saying, no, we can't cope with this business as usual, that's going to kill us anymore. So yeah, it's a tool, but it's not a magic thing that makes things happen. How are carbon budgets decided? Yeah, there's a whole methodology. In fact, a draft methodology was already published 2 years ago. There has been a voluntary carbon budget system in place. It's a complex question. I've looked through that and definitely don't understand it all myself. There are different ways. And yeah, I mean, I guess they try to find something that is quite objective and kind of easily properly calculatable. But yeah, it'll remain to be seen exactly how how those carbon budgets are allocated. But it's supposed to be well, the allocation is not transparent, but the methodology is supposed to be. But it takes quite a bit of unpicking to really understand what they're saying, and that work is still evolving. Someone's saying they don't agree that public participation for approval of carbon budgets is nefarious. Opening up to public participation would delay the system with public engagement, where the public has probably no technical knowledge. I mean, you could say this about most public participation. And at the end of the day, public participation, I mean, it needs to be conducted properly and it needs to be meaningful. But it's not to say that public participation automatically delays everything. So I'm not sure I agree with you there, especially if we look at the past where something like the allocation of carbon budgets was not done that soundly. It's everyone's carbon space and everyone's environment. So I don't see why people shouldn't have a say. What makes Morocco's NDC adequate? I don't know, possibly being a really good location for solar photovoltaics, which can get exported to Europe. That is my guess. I don't really know. Is it acceptable for the minister to argue in favor of job creation or economic development? I mean, NEMA and the kind of environmental law regime in the country does look at things like needs and desirability and sustainable development. So it's not that minister's domain. But ideally, yeah, it should be sitting more elsewhere, and the environment minister should be the one putting the brakes on activity that's claimed to create jobs but doesn't. I mean, this jobs thing gets misused. You know, people motivate for developments that are and claim that it's economic development that's going to create jobs, and it actually creates very few jobs or very specialist jobs. And the overall impact on jobs is not properly evaluated. And I think of the Musina Mukara Special Economic Zone, where the proponents of that development are promising jobs, and but the impact on agriculture jobs and on tourism jobs, for example, is not taken into account in that assessment. There are many studies showing that switching to renewable energy, and you can look at the court papers of our cancelled coal case, provides twice the jobs of building a new coal-fired power station in those particular circumstances. There are industrialization opportunities. It's not simple, but with the right political will and choosing the right direction, we can make a greener economy. If burning fossil fuels was that great for the economy, why do we have the unemployment and the inequality and the poverty that we do? So these things are flying in, and I'm certainly not tracking all of them. And Dila, does the Act list the greenhouse gases? The Act itself doesn't list them, but it makes provision for the minister to list them, and they are there. I see Laurel's got a hand up. Maybe we can take some hands. I think I need to unmute or something. Sorry, I'm learning how to drive this. Laurel, do you want to ask? And then Malik, and then Dimitri.
Thanks so much, Brandon, and thanks for the really great presentation, and everyone for the great questions. Really appreciating the space. And yeah, I think for me, it's really just the question of, is there a space where we can link our collective efforts around monitoring the implementation of the Act? Because we each specialize in our own areas. But if we have some way of pooling our knowledge and maybe having some way of doing some shadow monitoring, or yeah, I just feel like it would be so valuable. I know for us, we will specialize in land and agriculture, but we can feed that into something bigger that goes beyond what we can do on our own. So that for me would be probably the biggest takeaway in terms of the next steps. If there is a collective that maybe we can become part of, or something we can be involved in growing, because there's so much energy. And yeah, I think, you know, you were talking about the importance of growing civil society capacity and working with our communities and bringing communities into this dialogue so they can directly hold government accountable. So I think collectively we are stronger. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Laurel. Great point, and strongly agree. I really think this is exactly what we need. It's happening informally to a degree. I think obviously we're quite central to a lot of this work and have a lot of information on the website, but it really does need, yeah, a great collective effort to do that. And how that looks, I'm not sure, but hopefully conversations like this kind of help give rise to that. But there's so many pieces, and as you say, land, agriculture, health, infrastructure. Yeah, so many voices that need to come to this, and strongly agree. And let's hold space for that to develop. Malek?
Thanks so much, Brandon. Actually, a bit of my question was covered in that last one, so thanks for asking that. My question is about the financial sector. I'm not sure if I missed it, but does it have any implications on, say, our commercial banks, our big pension funds, etc.? Is there anything that we can sort of latch on to there as activists to hold them to that?
Good question, and unfortunately not directly. I mean, we can again use those principles and objectives in our advocacy against banks, for example, or towards banks. The impact would be kind of indirect in that those projects that they want to finance will be subject to the carbon budgets and the sectoral emissions targets. So yeah, that could be a whole lot stronger. And I mean, certainly in the process of pushing for a stronger act, ideas like this came around, including ideas that to enable loss and damage compensation. But yeah, it's not there. I think some indirect tools, as I say, but certainly no silver bullet. And it's more the clients that those banks intend to service and lend money to that are going to have the restrictions, which will obviously have some kind of upward effect. But yeah, unfortunately not the kind of thing we'd like to see. Dimitri.
Hi, Brandon. Thanks for the great presentation. Quick question about biodiversity and its relationship to climate. So, I mean, internationally, we're seeing a push to unify these two agendas. And I'm curious if you mentioned the ecosystem services, which is, again, seems to be commodifying biodiversity of ecosystems. And I'm wondering if there's other opportunities to connect these agendas, especially in terms of recent biodiversity legislation. And I suppose another question related to that, I mean, are there also opportunities to start looking at indigenous knowledge systems and their relationship to climate and climate work? And then how that can then connect with these issues of agriculture and land and, you know, kind of have broader, deeper discussions of how climate works.
Thanks, Dimitri. Yeah, I mean, very important, not specifically related to the act perhaps, but yeah, I mean, I think the interlinkages between climate and biodiversity are increasingly being recognized, and certainly we bring diversity arguments into our predominantly climate-focused work, and vice versa. We work with the Biodiversity Law Center, for example. I think, yeah, whether sort of kind of merging them maybe at global diplomatic level would be useful or not, I don't know. It might be more complicated, but certainly I think what we all want to see is that the impacts of climate on biodiversity and potentially vice versa when we think of ecosystem-based mitigation and adaptation are critically important. So yeah, hopefully those understandings will increase. And again, it's the kind of thing that interested groups could kind of establish forums and initiatives and that kind of thing. So hopefully we'll see that coming to fruition more and more. At the end of the day, as I said earlier, the biodiversity and the climate are actually symptoms of more fundamental economic and socially unjust ways of going about things and business. Melikaya. Melikaya, you should be able to unmute. Okay, gosh, sorry, there are lots of questions I can see. We did say we'd be done by now. I'm happy to carry on answering a few. I mean, anyone that needs to leave obviously can. Milikai, if you get to unmute, just shout out. At this point, I've unmuted you from my end, so you should be able to.
Am I audible now?
There we go. Yes, I can hear you now.
All right, all right. Thank you very much. Mine has got to do with the obligation of powers that are invested in the appointment of these provincial and municipal forum. So I'm trying to check, are there any possibility of civil society being represented in this forum and some other stakeholders? That's my point. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Melika. I didn't hear you that well, but yeah, I think those forums are pretty much prescribed in terms of who sits on them. I think what we do need to see, and we do see it in places, is civil society and community voices, etc. Trying to engage with the people on those forums as much as possible and ensure that that there's proper dialogue and proper information share and that kind of thing. So I don't know if one can't necessarily legally compel, but what we want to do is push for a political will to have proper consultation at those levels, which is something that happens in places and unfortunately doesn't happen in far too many others. The recordings will be made available. Yes. Does the Act outline incentives for companies to move towards renewable energy? Not incentives per se, but again, those tools of a carbon budget. If, for example, a company is reliant on fossil fuel energy for its activities, the carbon budgets and those sort of mechanisms indirectly provide an incentive, but no, actual incentive measures would be something that would probably come from National Treasury, and there's certainly space for things like that, but not catered for in this act specifically. From Paddy, the concern about Namakwa monitoring, which we certainly share. Yeah, inadequacy of testing stations and monitors. So this act, no, it won't provide any level of quality control. And that's a concern about greenhouse gas emissions reporting. It's not actually based for the most part on measurement. There is a kind of globally accepted system that says if you're running a coal plant of this technology with these kinds of capacities, those are the greenhouse gas emissions. So a lot of it is based on kind of a paper exercise. It should be quite accurate, but one's also relying on the integrity of the information fed into those reports, which may or may not be what it should be. So that is a concern. And at some point in this whole climate struggle, we're going to have to find a way of ensuring that greenhouse gas emissions data is in fact based on honest reporting, if you like. Folks, I think we're going to need to end there. But you are really welcome to contact us. I think this is certainly not the last by any means of webinars and discussions around the Climate Change Act. I think as we start to delve into the pieces and we start to see the practice out there, and we're going to see advocacy work streams develop. Maybe down the line, we'll see court cases. We'll gain more understanding of the implications. So we will, as always, keep sharing information and sending that out there. And yeah, going back to Laurel's point, hopefully we will have a broad civil society grouping that monitors and implements. For now, we need the president to sign. the Act, to operationalize it. So if there's any initial next step that you want to put energy into, and I know it's not easy to help those things happen, but I think some of us are talking about putting together an open letter to the president and asking him to kindly sign as quickly as possible. All right, I think on that, thank you so much for joining us. It's really great to see this level of interest. I think we had 155 people at one point. And it just shows how much of an issue of concern this is for all of us. And this act is a good starting point, but it's certainly not the end point. So with that, thank you very much. Wishing all of you a good Friday and weekend, and yeah, I look forward to engaging when we do. Thanks all.
Thank you, Brandon. Thank you, everyone.